everyone, and welcome to our University Scholar Series. I'm Magdalena Barrera, Vice Provost for Faculty Success, and it's my honor to be welcoming Dr. María Ledesma from the Department of Educational Leadership, who will be talking today about framing and decoding public narratives in the debate over race-conscious affirmative action. My next slide. Before we begin, we'd like to share the land acknowledgement for San Jose State University. While we gather at San Jose State University, we are gathered on the ethno-historic tribal territory of the Tamian Ohlone, who were the direct ancestors of the lineages enrolled in the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and who were missionized into Mission Santa Clara, San Jose, and Dolores. The lands on which San Jose State University is established was and continues to be of significance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. We also recognize that the ancestors of the Muwekma Ohlone constructed and maintained 3 Bay Area missions. Our campus extends to surrounding areas that held the Tupentak, a traditional roundhouse, which were located at the historic Lope Ñigos land grant Rancho Polsomí y Positas de las Animas, Little Wells of Souls, and also Marcelo, Pio, and Cristobal's land grant Rancho Listac, which were places of celebration and religious ceremonies, as well as nearby ancestral heritage shell mounds that served as the tribe's traditional cemetery sites and territorial monuments. San Jose State University also desires to honor the military service of the Muwekma who have honorably served overseas during World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, and who are still serving in the United States Armed Forces today. Before we begin as well, we'd like to share a couple of reminders that live captioning is enabled for this session, and this webinar is being recorded for folks who couldn't join us live. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function down below, and you can submit your question that way, and we look forward to a very lively discussion following Dr. Ledesma's presentation. And also, we'd like to thank our sponsors, which include the Office of the Provost, King Library, the Educational Leadership Program, the Spartan Bookstore, and the Division of Research and Innovation. And now back to introducing our speaker, Dr. María C. Ledesma, who uses she and her pronouns, is a first-generation college graduate and a professor of educational leadership and the founding director of the Higher Education Leadership Master's Program at San Jose State University, where she is also a department chair. As a critical race scholar, Dr. Ledesma's research broadly examines the sociology of race-conscious policy in higher education, including contextualizing and historicizing the history and application of race-conscious social policy in higher education and the examination of leadership for social justice. She is also interested in exploring the experiences of faculty of color who identify as first generation. In this presentation, Dr. Ledesma revisits the importance of decoding public narratives used to describe and explain polemic policies, such as race-conscious affirmative action. For example, she underscores the importance of always placing such policies within an accurate and rich historic context. And we really look forward to learning from her today. And with that, I'm very pleased to turn it over to Dr. Ledesma. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barrera. Thank you, everyone, for joining me this afternoon and for having the opportunity to be featured as a speaker in the SJSU University Scholar Series. I do want to underscore that I hope this is a conversation. I do have materials to share, but I do want us to engage in some Q&A as well. So as you heard, today I will be discussing one of the most controversial topics and policies in higher education, and that is race-conscious affirmative action. Since its inception, race-conscious affirmative action has been highly volatile, and it continues to be so to this day. As you heard from the introduction, one of the core strands of my research agenda has focused on understanding the power and the role of public discourse and public narrative in shaping opportunity. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So what you see before you are a few pieces that I've produced centering the examination of race and affirmative action. This is work that, I've been doing for quite some time. My dissertation was based on this work and continues to be, again, a core pillar of my current research. Next slide. As a student, I also had the opportunity to sit as a student regent for the University of California system. And it just coincided that the year that I would sit as student regent would mark 10 years after the passage of Proposition 209. As such, one of the projects that I spearheaded was to have the University of California take a holistic and systemic view of the impact of eliminating race-conscious admissions and race-conscious policies across the system. So what you see before you, the document that is largest on your screen, is the study group for university diversity, which I spearheaded as student regent. One of the things that I think brings me great joy is that this work continues to have resonance. The report has been cited by the University of California amicus brief that has been submitted in several cases, including the two cases in the University of Fisher versus the University of Texas, the Schuette versus the Coalition to Defend Affirmative Action case, and then most recently, in both of the cases that stand before the Supreme Court, the students for fair admissions against the University of North Carolina and student for fair admissions against Harvard. In addition, if you listen to the oral arguments, you will note that Justice Sotomayor explicitly cites the UC brief and some of the materials that are highlighted therein. Next slide, please. So anyone who knows me, especially my students, will tell you that I believe that history and context are essential to understanding issues of equity and social justice, including educational access and opportunity. So what you see before you are two quotes that guide my teaching, research, and service philosophies. The first quote by Justice Thurgood Marshall, which reads, "None of us got where we are solely by pulling ourselves up from our bootstraps. We got here because somebody bent down and helped us pick up our boots," is very close to my heart. As a self-proclaimed beneficiary of race-conscious affirmative action policies, this quote is very important to me. It reminds me both of the power of community and the power of opportunity. The second quote by critical race scholar and Louisiana State University president, Dr. William Tate, reads as follows: "Justice is not static, it is complex and time dependent. Context is everything when you're talking about justice." So if you're familiar with Dr. Tate's work, he is a prolific scholar and researcher who, alongside Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, introduced the application of critical race theory to the study of K-12 opportunity. I share these quotes because they are core tenets in my work. As you've heard, I believe that history and context are imperative in addressing issues of justice, of opportunity, of equity, and including educational justice. Next slide, please. So in line with this, I believe it's important to provide you with some of my context. Indeed, like my work, this project embodies the research as me search binary, and it is informed by all facets of my background. I am a critical race scholar whose research agenda broadly examines the sociology of race-conscious policy in higher education. I am most concerned with historicizing and contextualizing race-conscious affirmative action policy and practice, with the goal of advancing and expanding educational access and opportunity for historically minoritized students of color. Due to the politically charged nature of this work, I approach this work through an intersectional and multi-systems analysis. This means examining affirmative action as a social construction and a product of historical, political, legal, economic convergences and divergences across macro systems, mesosystems, microsystems with federal, state, and institutional policies. An important contribution of this work is recoupling affirmative action with its historical roots, as well as understanding that education is neither produced nor implemented in a vacuum. My work has always been interdisciplinary to encourage a rigorous approach to the study of educational opportunity. I'm also a qualitative scholar, and I rely on a multi-pronged theoretical and methodological toolkit to get this work done. And the project that I'll be sharing with you are excerpts of past studies, but also some current thinking. Next slide, please. So critical race legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw argued that what most people think they know about affirmative action isn't right, and what is right about affirmative action, most people don't know. Indeed, since its inception, affirmative action has remained among the most maligned and misunderstood social policies in public and legal debates surrounding educational opportunity, especially concerning post-secondary access. Too often, these debates are dehistoricized, resulting in, at best, simplistic, and at worst, disingenuous mischaracterizations. Moreover, the policy is described very differently by its supporters and its detractors. Within college admissions, those who seek to uphold affirmative action suggest it is an indispensable tool in the quest for educational equity and social justice, while opponents see it as nothing more than a blatant, even illegal attempt at providing privilege and privileging race above all other factors in granting admission to the nation's most selective post-secondary institutions. So confusion around the policy begins with misunderstandings about what the policy is and is not. So the policy can be traced back to executive orders first introduced by President John F. Kennedy and later signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson in 1965 in an effort to provide and promote civil liberties and civil rights to those who have historically been shut out from employment and educational opportunities. More recently, the policy has been described as, quote, a catch-all phrase, referring to laws, customs, and social policies intended to alleviate the types of discrimination that limit opportunities for a variety of demographic groups in various social institutions, end quote. So in theory, affirmative action has sought to, quote, mitigate the current blindnesses of institutions and decision makers, end quote, and to, quote, extend a hand to eminently qualified people previously held back by bias, end quote. In the practice of college and university admissions, affirmative action allows for race to be one factor among many in the holistic review of applicants for college entrance. Ironically, affirmative action, race-conscious affirmative action, wields less power than more deeply institutionalized but less scrutinized forms of affirmative action, such as legacy admissions. Next slide, please. So what's at stake in these debates? The debates over race-conscious affirmative action. Well, according to Chang and his colleagues, at the core of the debates around affirmative action is access to capital, social and cultural capital. As they note, if admission to selective universities were not seen as a gateway to other financial opportunities, then race-conscious policies that grant access to that gateway would draw little fire. but clearly attending and graduating from elite elective institutions affords significant tangible benefits. The observation made by Chang and his colleagues was recently echoed by Justice Elena Kagan, who during oral arguments in Students for Fair Admissions versus the University of North Carolina just this past October 31st, noted that race-conscious admissions into selective universities do indeed represent more than something that diversifies the student body. Race-conscious admissions into selective colleges and universities, according to Justice Kagan, are, quote, pipelines to leadership in our society. It might be military leadership, it might be business leadership, it might be leadership in the law, it might be leadership in all kinds of different areas. Universities are the pipeline to that leadership, end quote. Next slide, please. Even so, too few are familiar with the roots of affirmative action. Instead, as I will share, the policy is framed by buzzwords and stereotypes that weigh it down. From Bakke versus the Regents of the University of California, to Grutter v. Bollinger and Gratz v. Bollinger, to the University of Fisher 1 and 2, and more recently to the Students for Fair Admissions versus the University of North Carolina and Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, the public comes largely to understand affirmative action through incomplete histories that through trigger words and phrases. So prophetically, Justice O'Connor, who authored that majority opinion in the Supreme Court's decision in Grutter v. Bollinger, which upheld the limited use of race, reminds us to keep context in mind when understanding race-conscious policy. Next slide, please. So one of the projects that I've undertaken is that I examined the body of Supreme Court documents in the University of Michigan affirmative action cases. So there was an undergraduate case, Gratz v. Bollinger, and a graduate/law school case, Grutter v. Bollinger. And here I had an opportunity again to examine the Supreme Court's majority, concurring and dissenting opinions, as well as the body of amicus curiae or friend of the court briefs that were filed in the case. So I was interested in this project for several reasons, not the least of which that this was the first time after the University of California, the Regents of the Bakke versus the Regents of the University of California case, that the Supreme Court would be hearing an affirmative action case. And I was very curious to understand what were the arguments framing both the defense and the attack against race-conscious policy. I was also taken aback by the fact that the case drew in a record number of amicus curiae briefs. And so if you may be familiar that friend of the court briefs can be filed in support of either the petitioner, who is the person who introduces the case, or the respondent. And here the petitioner were Jennifer Gratz and Barbara Grutter. The respondent was the University of Michigan. And you had groups, folks from private industry, military leaders, Fortune 500 companies, public intellectuals, scholars, lending their voice to add to why we should either uphold or end the use of race-conscious policy. And again, I think it's important to keep in mind that one of the things that I was looking for was not just what the argument was in the documents, in the amicus briefs, but what then was so resonant that perhaps the court would mention it in their final oral arguments and their final opinions. So what I found was the following. Next slide, please. So what I found were that there were 5 prominent narratives and storylines that frame the discourse challenging race-conscious affirmative action. By contrast, there were 8 prominent narratives and storylines that framed the discourse defending race-conscious affirmative action. Next slide. So what you see before you here in rank order were what I found to be the top 5 narratives that were used by those amicus brief filers to challenge affirmative action. So you see here that, they argued that affirmative action was simply a proxy for quotas and or preferences. They also said that affirmative action was discriminatory, that it was non-meritorious, granting access and admission to students who were unqualified and admitted simply because of their race, that affirmative action was outdated, that we had come to a place in time where it was no longer necessary, that affirmative action was actually damaging to the very individuals that it intended to help, the intended beneficiaries. These are arguments that continue to echo through to the contemporary arguments against affirmative action. By contrast, next slide, when I looked to those arguments that were used to defend the policy, to defend race-conscious affirmative action, what I found was that, chief among these was the argument that there is no other way to attain the type of racial diversity that institutions seek without a race-conscious affirmative action plan, a race-conscious affirmative action policy. That diversity goals are an exercise in academic freedom and the First Amendment granted to post-secondary institutions, and that diversity that is a byproduct of affirmative action policies is a learning and pedagogical tool that benefits students and the institutions. As you heard echoed in Justice Kagan's very recent comments, diversity has a leadership benefit. That diversity is necessary in a global marketplace. So you'll notice a lot of the arguments in defense of affirmative action really hinge on this notion of the byproduct of affirmative action being diversity. That diversity is necessary for our national security. It's interesting to think about the time when these cases were argued before the court was also the time when there were military operations happening at the same time. That diversity is a public good. And finally, that diversity is a direct result of race-conscious affirmative action. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I came away with was that there was this historical amnesia, especially on the part of the critics of race-conscious policy, that many of the narratives surrounding critiques of affirmative action were both acontextual and ahistorical, and replete with omissions and or contradictions. And curiously enough, I had the chance recently to rehear the most recent affirmative action cases, the oral arguments before the Supreme Court. And even then, again, there was some misinterpretations, mischaracterizations of the impact and the need of race-conscious policy. So what this demonstrates is, discussions around affirmative action have always been emotionally charged. Though not everyone is familiar with the policy's complex history, everyone seems to have an opinion about its future. Proponents stress, again, that there is no proxy that can replace the consideration of race in university admissions. And by contrast, opponents are quick to proclaim that we have arrived at the time and place when we no longer need to depend on race-conscious policies, that we should strive to admit students on merit alone. Not understanding that you need to unpack, who has merit, who defines what merit is, what opportunities are available to gain college preparation. One of the things that I think is most disingenuous is that often critics of affirmative action call upon Dr. King's "I have a dream" speech to underscore their point. They argue that in any continuance of race-conscious policies is in direct contradiction and actually undermines Dr. King and his vision, where children are, quote, to be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I think it's also interesting to keep in mind that around the time of the Grutter and Gratz cases, and Grutter in particular, which is actually the case that upheld the limited use of race in higher education, that there was the introduction of what Justice O'Connor labeled the sunset clause. The idea that even though the court was endorsing the continued limited use of race in higher education, that they also signaled that there should be a time when the use of race would have to come to an end. They gave that a 25-year window. So that was in 2003. We are fast approaching, that 25-year marker. And again, this was something that was echoed and underscored several times in the recent Supreme Court cases. Next slide, please. So one of the things, you can click, there we go. I think one of the things that we have seen is that the court of public opinion is proving to be as important as the legal courtroom. Likewise, the need to interrogate and decipher the normative narratives that frame public debates and they remain critical. So linguist George Lakoff tells us that, quote, frames facilitate our most basic interactions with the world. They structure ideas and concepts. They shape the way that we reason, and they even impact how we perceive and how we act. For the most part, our use of frames is unconscious and automatic. We use them without realizing it, end quote. As a critical race scholar, I can also tell you that often these frames are normed to privilege whiteness and advance white supremacy, and they need to be interrogated. Indeed, I call upon again scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, critical race scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, who examining this interplay between the media and the public understanding of affirmative action shared the following, quote, the public debate on affirmative action receives and amplifies the opponent's backstory, both in terms of what it chooses to highlight and what it systemically chooses to ignore. The growing sense that race discrimination systemically is passé and largely irrelevant is amplified. It is, if not actually produced, is in the media's failure to actively report on the reasons why affirmative action is necessary. So again, this notion of incomplete stories, of depending on buzzwords and catchphrases, stereotypes to frame the debate over race-conscious policy. In the two magazine covers you see before you, even the use in the Time cover of that quota sign, right? And then in the Newsweek cover, the question of do we still need affirmative action, and framing it, with a very particular type of personification of a person of color there. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I wanted to be for sure able to share with you today is some of the backstory and some of the back work that is happening around pushing these cases forward. So you see here two pictures. These are screenshots. The first one with the red banner was caught, I took the screenshot shortly after the University of Michigan cases, and where the court, again, upheld affirmative action by a very limited margin. And this, as you see here, it is a screenshot by an organization that was formerly the Project for Fair Representation. And if you can read the text there in the red, it says, were you denied admission to Harvard? It may be because you're the wrong race. So part of the reason that I share this with you is because the cases that come before the court are not accidental. There are architects that are pushing these cases forward. And Edward Blum is a key figure in advancing not just anti-affirmative action cases, but he's also been responsible in voter redistricting, in other race-conscious social policies, and limiting that ability to have race-conscious policy. The Project for Fair Representation is no longer, and now what we have is an organization called Students for Fair Admissions, and they are the ones in the screenshot that is larger with the kind of blue teal boxes. And here you see a much more sophisticated website where it is asking, help us eliminate race and ethnicity from college admissions. If you were to scroll this website, you would see that there are boxes where you can fill in your name, and you can disclose whether you feel if you have been discriminated against, and you then become part of either their class action, or you may become someone that they contact. So part of the reason that I share this is because, again, there is an orchestrated movement behind not just limiting the use of race in higher education admissions, but it's also very prevalent in financing, many other anti-race conscious movements. And they're also key in shaping some of the public discourse and public narrative. Here, obviously, a central discourse that you see is the framing of the Asian victim. Whereas in the earlier cases, in the Grutter and Gratz cases, the two plaintiffs that were presented there were white women. But because there was not, a successful turnout in their estimation of overturning affirmative action, they decided to take on this new role of framing the Asian student as victim, which is obviously in itself very invidious. It is suggesting that Asian students are a monolith, that there isn't diversity, and it also misrepresents the fact that it was not Asian students who brought this challenge before the court. It was very much financed by Edward Blum and his colleagues, Edward Blum being a key figure there. I think it's important also to recognize the counterbalance to someone like Edward Blum is other groups such as Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and they produced a campaign to directly speak back to this work, and it's titled "Not Your Wedge." And if you were to look up their materials, you would see that again they speak to the fact that many people in the Asian community actually support race-conscious policy. Nonetheless, you have, next slide, you have as a result of the work of Edward Blum, he's been very successful. You have the cases that are literally now before the Supreme Court. I mentioned them already: Students for Fair Admissions versus the University of North Carolina, and Students for Fair Admissions versus the President and Fellows of Harvard College. And these cases are noteworthy for many reasons, not the least of which is that they are sitting before one of the most conservative courts in probably a lifetime, and that they have the very likely potential of ending the use of affirmative action policies in higher education as we have come to know it. So it's the work that Edward Blum has endeavored to do for decades is actually getting traction, and very likely will pay off with a very different outcome than has previously happened in the Supreme Court with regard to the future of race-conscious policy. I think it's also noteworthy to keep in mind that the challenge against Harvard College is distinct from all other challenges so far to race-based policy in higher education, because it Harvard College represents not just a private college, but the private college. And in addition to that, Harvard College also has a very storied history with affirmative action. If you go back to the Bakke case, you will see that part of the reason that the limited use of race was upheld in Bakke was in fact because the court endorsed the Harvard plan. And yet here it is now before the Supreme Court and very much under attack. Next slide, please. So one of the things to take away as we think about, the next steps here is that, again, the opposition to affirmative action is deeply entrenched, that critics of these policies often rely on ahistorical and acontextual framing to claim that affirmative action is unfair, outdated, that it's nothing more than a ruse for an illegal quota system. As I mentioned already, the misuse of Dr. King, misquoting them, the works of Dr. King. One of the things that I always think about is how, even though critics of affirmative action will misquote Dr. King, there have been amicus briefs filed on behalf of the families of civil rights leaders who actually say something to the contrary and say, actually, Dr. King would have endorsed the use of race-conscious policy. Nonetheless, detractors of affirmative action are also silent to the enormous benefits that are bestowed to students who have historically been shut out of higher education. And of course, this is intentional. Affirmative action has been responsible for integrating not just the college classroom, but the corporate boardroom, and precisely by taking in a person's character into account, including their race and gender, a holistic account of the individual in the selection process. Next slide, please. I think something that is curious about the two cases that are currently pending before the Supreme Court is that they're spotlighting issues that in the past have been mentioned for sure. They've made their way into not just the court's documents, but into the public realm in terms of arguments for and against the policy. And one of those has been legacy admissions. So again, in the current cases, you had a long exchange between the justices and the counsel, both for the university and actually the counsel for those who are opposing affirmative action to question the continued use of legacies, and in particularly legacies at Harvard, which I think is a unique narrative that we haven't seen before. I think it's also important to keep in mind that this challenge comes on the heels of the Operation Varsity Blues happened, just a few years ago, where there was a large federal ring that was discovered that, had parents, very wealthy parents, paying for admission of their children into, again, some of the nation's most selective institutions. So this questioning of legacy, I think, is really going to be interesting as we expect a decision. What role, if any, will be used by the justices to limit the use of legacy? I think also it's important that another item that is being highly questioned in these cases that has not happened in the past is the issue of academic freedom. So in previous cases, Justice Frankfurter is known as kind of signaling the 4 essential freedoms of academic freedom, and that is the ability for a post-secondary institution to determine for itself on academic grounds who may teach, what may be taught, how it shall be taught, and who may be admitted to study. And that actually right now is also in the direct line of fire by some of the most conservative justices on the courts, questioning whether the Supreme Court should give deference to post-secondary institutions when it comes to issues of race. And finally, one of the key things that I think the current court is seeking to do is to actually overturn Grutter. So this is something that was not brought up in previous lawsuits. This is something that is intentionally being sought now, is to overturn Grutter, which again endorses and upholds Bakke and the limited use of race. Next slide, please. So click, please. Yeah, in California, obviously, we have seen that, the use of manipulation in framing critiques and attacks on race-conscious policy is nothing new. We've had decades where we've seen Proposition 187, titled the Save Our State Initiative, which actually sought to limit services to undocumented Spanish-speaking individuals. We had Proposition 209, the California Civil Rights Initiative, which sought to and actually did eliminate the use of race-conscious policies in admissions, employment, and contracting. Proposition 227, English for the Children Initiative, which sought to basically end what 187 could not, the use of English bilingual services for Spanish-speaking and other students. And then Proposition 54, which sought to basically end the collection of race data in any type within the state. There's a long history of this manipulation of public discourse. The thing that I will share as my last slide, and this is where we'll end, next slide, please, is just again to chronicle that this notion of public narrative is something that happens before us all the time. And you'll see the 4 covers of magazines that I highlight here really delve into this notion of critiquing affirmative action. But I wanted to juxtapose that with the 3 bottom covers that I think even in the recent oral arguments, we're not that far away from, having lived through Ferguson and the uprisings that happened as a result of the continued murder of young Black men and women of color, specifically Black young men and women. And yet, these are arguments also that seem to fall by the wayside and become part of that ahistorical, acontextual narrative. So we'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ledesma, for your presentation. And some questions have come through, and we'll get to them right now. And I just want to encourage folks who may still be processing and kind of formulating your questions, please be sure to share them and contribute to today's discussion. So the first question is connecting some of the research that you just shared with us to the broader work that you do here at San Jose State in particular. And so the question is, how has your research on affirmative action informed how you approach developing perhaps the first comprehensive master's program in higher education at SJSU? Can you please share how some of the core competencies these students will leave the program with as they relate to the issues that you raised today?
Sure. No, thank you for that question. I appreciate it. As I said, and as I hope was clear, that this research is me search, and it's very much drives everything that I do, everything that I do, not just scholarship wise, but also as is being suggested here when we're thinking about a higher education leadership master's program. What can we bring in and apply from this research to the master's program? And we have our inaugural cohort now that I hope what they're seeing and taking away is that this program was very much developed with the idea of centering the need to embrace an equity-minded approach to higher education. And if you're familiar with the work of Dr. Estela Ben-Simon, who coined the term equity-mindedness, one of the things she does is remind us that in order for us to address inequity, we first have to understand why inequity exists. And so that means being race conscious. That means being attuned to inequity in different forms and how that shapes opportunity. And I think we were very intentional in framing our master's program to address issues of equity and social justice throughout all of the curriculum. We don't have just a standalone diversity course. And I want to stress that also, this was not just a personal philosophy, but this is actually something also we heard from our collaborators, from our peers, for example, at the leadership in local community colleges, who told us we need this. So that was a reaffirmation that we were headed in the right direction. But I think that it's something that, again, we're hoping that we are walking our talk.
Excellent, thanks. Our next question is asking, would really love to hear your thoughts on the parallels between these affirmative action debates that you share here and some of the local school district cases where certain parent groups are arguing to remove race-conscious high school admissions, for example.
Yeah, I think that there are direct parallels between the two. And obviously we don't have to go too far to think also about the uproar that happened in the wake of people finding out that there's such a thing as critical race theory, and then, being very offended that there was a possibility that their child would learn actual history, right? Because that's one of the things that critical race theory is not indoctrinating anyone. What it is doing is giving an accurate accounting of history. And I think there's always pushback when the narrative is not yours, when the majoritarian narrative is being questioned. And we also have, if you look at the Supreme Court, the irony is that the Supreme Court has been used as a pathway to gain access, to gain some advancement of opportunity for historically marginalized groups, but increasingly it is kind of curtailing and scaling back that access. I'm also thinking of the parents involved case, where this is where you famously heard the current Chief Justice say that we need to actually not basically utilize race. And I think that I'm not optimistic, unfortunately, for the outcome of the current cases, but I'm very much looking forward to the dissents that are going to be written by Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson.
Thanks for that. With the next question actually kind of speaks to something that occurred to me. I was really struck when I was listening to your talk about the parallels between how affirmative action is framed and discussed, particularly in the mainstream media outlets, with now critical race theory, right? Also being depicted in certain ways and very much demonized, very similar language across. And this next question, as kind of in that mold, I think, this participant is sharing, I'm intrigued by your point about acontextual and ahistorical narratives surrounding affirmative action. Can you speak to whether these narratives reflect a broader white racial frame in higher education?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think that, again, the use of the acontextual, ahistorical framing is not accidental. It's very purposeful. It's interesting that if I mentioned the amicus briefs, and the amicus briefs are, again, they're going to support, one side or the other. But I think it's always telling that the volume of amicus briefs that are filed in defense of affirmative action are basically supported by, hundreds of studies, by hundreds of scholars who run, again, numerous simulations. And then the critiques against doing away with race conscious policy, those arguments against the continuance of affirmative action, are critiqued because their experts cherry pick data, right? They don't provide a holistic analysis of they don't provide the volume of peer-reviewed literature that is produced. So I think that, there are echoes that, we are at a point in time where obviously we've seen a movement of very outspoken, very motivated rise of white nationalism. And it is not surprising to me that it coincides with an attack, an outright attack on critical race theory, which has existed for 20 plus years, and people are just finding out about it and just now being offended. So I think that all of these things coincide, right? The march, the Tiki Torch March, the attack on the Capitol, all of these things are being fomented by a rising white nationalist movement. And part of this is also the attack on affirmative action.
With the next question, it's a nice link to what you just shared about some of these arguments approach and how the ways they cherry pick whatever. And I want to use that as a kind of pivot to kind of delving into your methodology. This question here is, and thank you for sharing your work with us. As you approach your methodology, I was wondering how you choose which narratives, oral arguments, magazine headlines, newspapers, et cetera, to examine. How do you think through which archives to engage with as you were approaching this study?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that is important to keep in mind with the study of the arguments in the majority, concurring, dissenting opinions on the amicus briefs, I looked at the body of legal documents. So I looked at the entirety of it. I didn't, weed out anyone. I wanted to know what both sides said. I wanted to know what the arguments on both sides were. And again, I wanted to know which of these arguments rose up to the Supreme Court level when the justices wrote their final opinions. As far as the public narratives, I think we used to have the hard copy magazines, and to see them on the newsstands, and I think they're very provocative, right? In terms of what pictures end up on those covers. And then there's also a tradition. If you go back to, Time magazines in the era of the civil rights movement, they were very important. There is one of the stories that I like to share with my students is that, the power of Jet magazine, when it highlighted the murder of Emmett Till, actually resulted in increased numbers of Black Americans registering to vote. It had a real amplified effect. And I think that these magazines that we receive in our homes, likewise, they are signaling to us the stories that are being framed as important. Obviously, we are now also at a different time and place where we have dedicated news channels that 24/7 will frame narratives to one particular vantage point. But I am curious to see what is it, what is the lead in terms of the header in articles and in blog posts and what have you, because I think that again lends itself to framing that public narrative.
Great, thanks. This next question is about the disconnect between inequities in access and opportunities in K through 12 schooling, and arguments against affirmative action are obviously intentional, yet boggle the mind. In what ways does the intentionally unjust K through 12 educational system make its way into these arguments at the higher education level? And I like this question, right? It's getting us to think about a continuum of arguments that span an educational journey.
Yeah. So I was very fortunate to, as a postdoc, one of the people who I had the opportunity to engage with on a limited basis, I wish I had more an opportunity to engage with him, is he's now a circuit court judge, Goodwin Liu. But you can also look at his scholarship. And one of the things that he reminds us of is that if Brown v. Board of Education, which actually was intended to desegregate, equalize educational opportunities for students of color, Black students in particular, if that had been successful, we would have no need for affirmative action policies right now. But the fact that we are currently even more segregated than at the time pre-Brown, I think is very telling, because again, this notion that we arrive at the admissions application process on equal footing is just completely erroneous. There are still obviously vast inequities, and the preparation that happens at a highly resourced school where you have access to not just resources but qualified teachers, where you don't have the teacher turnover, where you have adequate funding. It's going to be much different than in an institution where you have the opposite, where you have high turnover, where you have inadequate facilities, where you don't have the materials, where you have needs, for example, in budgeting for just the maintenance of upkeeping a building that is crumbling, that that there are vast inequities. And again, that's part of that ahistorical narrative, that the assumption that we arrived at that starting line at the same time with the same skills, and that's just not true.
Great, and we have time for one more question. There's two in the queue, and I think they're along the same lines. And it's a little bit of pressure, Dr. Ledesma, to give us some big tips with like a minute left, pressure's on.
Mm-hmm.
But, they're saying, your work in the MA in higher ed is inspiring. How can educational leaders across SJSU reframe the debate about affirmative action and critical race theory? What actions can we take to respond to that public rhetoric that devalues an equity-minded approach? And there's a related question here that's about, when thinking through these issues in the workplace, like how do you recommend that we discuss it when maybe there isn't the diversity of leadership that we might like to see, or that we're on the journey towards moving towards? But it's really like, what can we do? How can we help to push back against the ahistorical, acontextualized narratives that we see circulating about?
Yeah, that's a big challenge, but I appreciate the question, because I do think that is something as a takeaway in terms of to-dos, right? Tangible to-dos. And I guess I would start by saying that if you are having a conversation where someone is, promoting these ahistorical, acontextual narratives, of the follow-up of, tell me why you think that way, right? Of having them explain to you, why it is that this frame that they are presenting is the correct one. And then providing that counterbalance, in terms of, again, some of the materials that we covered today, that there actually are, larger discourses that need to be taken into account, that largely, the way that the public comes to understand these very polemical policies is on a very limited basis, with high dependence on, trigger words, on catchphrases, and that is an incomplete understanding of the policy. It's something that we all need to do, myself included. But I think that, with the timeliness of the current cases, it gives us an in to have those conversations. So I look forward to hearing those from all of you.
Absolutely. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Ledesma, for sharing your research with us. This has been a great way to conclude this series for this semester. I want to remind folks that if you haven't had a chance to watch some of the previously recorded lectures, there's a link in the chat where you can access and see really great talks you may have missed. Dr. Ledesma, your work has really been just so wonderful to hear about. Thank you for the work you're doing here, your leadership on campus, and look forward to seeing what comes next. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time. And yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.